Hello readers, it's Sasha, and today I'm going to be doing my July wrap-up. I just finished doing a live show with my good friends here on BookTube. So I'm a little drunk right now, but it's fine. I'm just going to be talking about the books that I've read this month and what I liked about them, what I didn't like about them, the star rating I gave them, the good stuff. I actually had a really good reading month this month. I don't know about you guys. A lot of the books that I read were part of my TBR game or part of videos that I was reading, and I feel like having a structure for what I was reading actually made my reading month a lot more enjoyable, and I was able to fully engage in what I was reading and have this idea as to what I should get to, and I was able to finish it, and I'm very thankful for that. So I'm just gonna dive right in. The first book that I ended up reading in the month of July was And Then There Were Four by Nancy Rowland. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. I've decided to start reading less critically because I feel like reading so critically, for me, takes the fun out of reading, and I stop enjoying the book as much. So I've started being a little less critical about the books, and I've just kind of been like vibing with them. I'm still drinking. Basically, I read And Then There Were Four, and the way this book started out was trash. Like, it literally, the first thing I read, this is supposed to be should I say what it's about? It's about these 5 kids who realize that their parents are like trying to kill them. Spicy? Yes. This book essentially was about that, obviously. And it started off straight bang boom into this as a second person novel. And I was like, what are you doing? I was like, Nancy, we should not be reading a YA thriller in second person. Like, are you good? Like, why the hell would you write a YA in second person? And then the next chapter was not in second person. I was like, okay, she chilled. Half of this book was in second person. And for a good 50% of this, I was like, why? What is the ever-loving point of having a book in second person, especially a young adult thriller? Like, I never understood that aspect of it, but I ended up really liking the ending, and halfway through the pace just picked up and it became a lot more enjoyable. So I definitely could see myself recommending this and reading this. Actually, you know what, I don't think I'd ever read this again, but I could see myself recommending it, and I think that's the most important part. So I ended up going with a 4 out of 5 for this one. The next book I read was 6 Months Later by Natalie D. Richards. I love her so much. So here's the thing. Young adult thrillers are trash. Like, they're trash, but let me just tell you that they're my favorite genre. Like, mysteries, thrillers, for me, those are like my guilty pleasures where I can read them, and most of the ones I read, I will give 5 stars because I'm so I'm enjoying my time reading them. Not necessarily that they're amazingly well-written, well-crafted stories. I just really like reading them. I ended up giving 6 Months Later 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it from page 1. Like, the minute it started, it didn't start with any nonsense. Like, the book is about a girl who wakes up 6 months later having no memory of the past 6 months, and her life is pretty much turned upside down. And so she's trying to figure out what happened during that 6 months. Like, why does she have no memory? Like, what happened, right? And that's really interesting to me, and the way that it was done creeped me out so much. Like, I was so creeped out over it, and it wasn't even that creepy. Like, I was just, the way that it was done and the fact that I read it at 3 a.m. made it a little bit creepier for me, so that's cool. I genuinely really liked it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and I really want to own it at some point because I think she's going to be one of those people who I just auto-buy their books because I really just enjoyed the premise and I really enjoyed the execution. So the next book that I ended up reading was Out of Tune by Nora McClintock, and this is a 3rd book in a series that I did not read the first 2 books for, so cheers to that. This is a book about a girl who's like trying to solve the murder of a fellow classmate and is doing a better job than the police. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It wasn't a bad book. Like, it was a good story, and I enjoyed my time reading it, and the characters were fine, whatever, but I didn't have a connection to the story. Like, I feel like because I hadn't planned on reading it, I'll link the vlog and all the videos that I did for all these books down below. I did this for a vlog, and this was not the initial book that I wanted to read for this vlog, but I just couldn't connect with the other one, so I read this one instead. And I feel like because I didn't have any connection to it at first, it made it less enjoyable for me to read, and I just ultimately didn't vibe with it in the way that I probably could have if I had been more invested in the story. But it also just didn't sit well with me that this teenage, whatever, 15, 16-year-old girl was doing a better job than the police. Like, the police saw one thing and they were like, well, obviously this happened. And it's like, how about you investigate? How about you do some freaking work and figure out who did it? I wish the adults in the story did more than the teenager in the story. Like, it just didn't sit well with me. The next book that I ended up reading was Rebel by Marie Lu, and this is a follow-up book, like 10 years later, from the Legend series by Marie Lu, but it focuses mostly on Eden Wing, which was Day from the Legend series, his younger brother, and it's focusing on what he's doing now 10 years later. And I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. I really liked the story. Like, overall, I liked being back in the world. I liked binge reading the series last month and then reading this new installment of it. Like, I really enjoyed that, but I didn't like it more than the original series, and the original series I gave 4 stars, so I couldn't give it over 4 stars. But I did like the writing. I did like learning more about Eden because he was a very important character, even though he wasn't in the original trilogy as much as the main characters, but ultimately he was a very interesting character to have, and I just liked being back in that universe. And I liked the way that they did it. I genuinely recommend reading the Legend trilogy by Marie Lu, and then if you're interested in 10 years later and kind of like what happens after the last book, I would definitely recommend picking up Rebel, because it's genuinely a very good story, and the way that Marie Lu writes stories is so good. Like, she's such a good storyteller, and I really genuinely would recommend you pick that up. So the next book that I ended up reading was the first book that I've ever annotated, and I regret annotating it because I don't care about the story. That is Incendiary by Zoraida Cordova. So I annotated very basically, like, I didn't do much, but it's fun to do that. This is about, what is this about? This is about a girl who was kidnapped at a very young age to work for the king because she has magical powers, but then she got rescued by this group called the Whispers, and then her, like, lover or whatever got kidnapped again by the kingdom, so she decided to go back into the kingdom and try to find him, and that's, like, the gist of it. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. Truthfully, this read like a 1.5 2-star read. I didn't like this at all. I didn't like anything about this. I did a review, and I will put that in the description below, but I just genuinely didn't love this story. I thought it was very trope heavy. It was very, like, general, basic YA fantasy, and I didn't love that about it. But oh, I'm sorry if you can hear my fan in the background, but I'm not going to turn it off because it's warm. I didn't love this. I didn't like the way that Cordova decided to make this so trope heavy. All of the characters were rude and unlikable, and I didn't really enjoy my time reading it, and I don't plan on picking up the sequel when it comes out because I don't care about anyone in the story enough to actually invest time in reading a sequel. But I did give it a 3-star because I thought that maybe my experience with it was clouded because it was a fantasy, and fantasy is something that I judge a lot more harshly because I don't like it as much. So I wanted to give it more of a fair shot, so I decided to go with 3 out of 5 stars. So the next book that I read was a book that not a lot of people loved. Like, a lot of people actually hated this book. And that is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. So this is a prequel novel to the Hunger Games about Coriolanus Snow, the president, and how he kind of came about, not as president because he's young, but kind of came to be like the person that he is now. And I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed my time reading this immensely. If I'm being perfectly honest, this read more like a 4.5 to 4-star read, but being back in the Hunger Games world, being involved in Suzanne Collins' writing again, it made me so happy, and the enjoyment I had while reading this was so exponential that I was just like, I have to give this 5 out of 5 stars. So I did. I ended up loving this story so much, and a lot of people are saying it doesn't need to be said and it didn't need to be told, and probably, but like, what story needs to be told? Like, realistically, like, this was an interesting installment, and I don't really think it's fair for us to rate books based on like if it needed to happen, because what book, like, what young adult book needs to happen? Like, that doesn't make really much sense. So that's why I gave this a rating based on the book itself, not whether or not the story needed to be told or not. So it was a 5 out of 5 star read, and I really loved it, and and I cannot wait to read The Hunger Games again and then read this with it to see what consistencies are there and what aren't, and I'm very, very looking forward to doing that. The next book that I read this month, hold on, let me finish my wine glass. The next book that I read this month was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I love this book. I will start by saying I really genuinely loved this book. However, the synopsis did a terrible job at describing what this story was, because it was about a circus. Like, yes, the circus is correct. The way that they describe it is correct. There are no announcements. It opens at midnight, closes at dawn. Like, that is correct. But then they talk a little bit about, like, this magician's competition within the synopsis. And they're like, there are these two people who end up falling in love in this magician's competition. So if you're looking for a basic, very, very basic idea of what the story is about, it's about this circus that is very random, makes no sense, and there are two people who are like in this magician's competition and they're falling in love with each other. That's a very basic description of what the story is. It is so much more than that. It's unreal. Like, it is insane. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars out of 5 because, truthfully, I loved it. I don't love lyrical writing as much, but for some reason, this just really worked for me. I think it's because I like circus stories and carnival stories, so I think that's probably why I ended up vibing with this as much as I did. But let me tell you, this was it. In so many ways, this was just 100% it. I had such a good time reading this, even though the synopsis doesn't do a fantastic job at describing what this book is about. If you haven't read it, just expect so much more and really not a lot of romance and affection. And in fact, like, that part of it was my least favorite part. Like, their relationship was my least favorite part of the story. I liked learning about everybody else and the circus itself. The relationship didn't really do anything for me, but everything else worked so well that I had to give this a 4.5 stars out of 5. So if you haven't read this and you're looking for a very interesting, lyrical, whimsical read about a circus, read this. The next book I read is Facing the Sun by Janice Lynn Mathers. This is a book that is coming out in August. Yes. End of August, I believe, or beginning of August, I don't know. It is about these 4 girls who live in the Bahamas, and basically they live on this one street, and at the end of the street is this beach, and this beach has just been bought by hotel developers to essentially develop like resorts and stuff like that. So they're dealing with their own like family issues, and then they're also dealing with this fact that part of their community is being taken away from them. And I gave this 4 to 5 stars. I couldn't relate to this story, so it was hard for me to rate this story in a way that made sense. But what I could rate the story on were the characters, and I didn't like them at all. The characters, like, these 4 girls were supposed to be friends, like 2 of them like best friends, and then the 4 of them all kind of knew each other because they lived very close to each other, but they were so nasty to each other and did things that I couldn't even imagine doing to my friends. And that's why I couldn't rate this book a 5 out of 5 stars, because the characters were just so unlikable in so many ways, and I didn't love that. However, the setting and the story itself was so interesting, especially for me reading it as a person who has never experienced this kind of life. I was able to get a little bit of a glimpse into this kind of a life, and I could get a glimpse into what it must be like for the people who live in the neighborhoods of the resorts that I would typically go visit. I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I liked getting different perspectives. It was interesting, and I recommend people to read this book because it's really good. And Janice Lynn Mathers is from the Bahamas, so this is an own voices story. So that's another reason why I would recommend picking this up. But I was very grateful to get approved. Oh my god. She's so fucking cute. Just vibing. The next book that I ended up reading was You Owe Me a Murder by Eileen Cook, and I read this in less than 24 hours. This was such a good read. Like, it was so good, and I had such a fantastic time reading it. It was about a girl who essentially is, like, complaining about her ex-boyfriend to this girl on a plane, and she was just like, yeah, like, haha, he died, haha. But then her ex-boyfriend ends up dead, and then she gets this note saying that, like, now you owe me a murder. And it was so interesting. Eileen Cook quickly became an author of mine that I I added most of her books to my TBR immediately after finishing this. This was such a 5 out of 5 star read for me. I don't necessarily think it was a fantastic thriller mystery novel. I don't, because it wasn't, but it was so interesting to read, and this is just a genre that I love so much that it was just enjoyable, and I enjoyed every single aspect of this book. And I hope to read more Eileen Cook very soon in the future, because honestly it was very good and it was a really interesting read, and I recommend this to everybody who likes a little bit of like trashy YA thrillers. Like, this is what that is. So the next book that I ended up reading was Where Dreams Descend by Janella Angeli. This is a book about a girl named Kalia who ends up joining this magician's competition in this city that is very mysterious and is frozen over and kind of in ruins, and that's pretty much the gist of the story. And I loved this book a lot. I gave this realistically 4 out of 5 stars, but for me, in enjoyment level, I would have given it like a 5 out of 5 stars. But when it comes to books that I'm reviewing for videos on my channel or for reviews for NetGalley, I feel like I have to be a little bit more critical as opposed to the books that I'm just reading for fun. I loved the characters, I loved the atmosphere, I loved the ideas. It was a fantastically interesting story. However, what I didn't love was the world building. I feel like we didn't get a single idea as to like what the magic system was or like what the town was. We were left with a lot more questions than we were left with answers. And that doesn't sit well with me in fantasies, especially the first book in a fantasy series. I like having things a bit more wrapped up so that I have a little bit more of an idea as to what's to come in the second or third or however many books are there. This is only a duology, so I feel like it was good in that regard. Like, I feel like this is set up for a good second book. However, I don't know if all of my questions can be answered in just one other story, so that's where I'm having a bit of trouble. But I genuinely love this book, and I cannot wait for more people to read this. This does come out in August, and I cannot wait for more people to get their hands on this book, because this is a time and a half. Next, I ended up reading the book that I got on my Goodreads TBR video, where I was literally like, oh my god, why do I have to read this? 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher. I did not pick this book up once. I actually checked the audiobook out of my library and listened to that instead, and I listened to it in like 24 hours because I listened to it on double the speed. And I don't know if I retained much of the story because, to be fair, I already knew what the story was about. I've watched the TV show, I know a little bit about it. So for me, I didn't need to pay as much attention to this book as I would to other books. However, I will say I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. The story itself was entertaining to listen to because the narrators were very good at narrating the story. Like, with whoever narrated Hannah Baker was very good. Whoever narrated, what's her face? Clay Jensen. They were also very good at this, and I thought that was what made it a more interesting listen for me, because listening to it, I had a good time, but thinking of the message of the story, thinking about a man who's writing a story about a woman's self-harm and suicide based on different like bullying and sexual harassments in her life doesn't sit well with me, because men cannot know how women process sexual harassment and process bullying, and I understand that every woman does it differently, but it's still not something that a man can actually understand and write about in a cohesive and effective way, because this just like, he'll never know. And I also just didn't like the glorification of suicide, because honestly, Hannah Baker as a character was very unlikable and very, like, the way that she was written was like, I killed myself and now all of you are gonna go down with me because I was upset that you did something, so look at me go. And I didn't like that, because that's not what suicide is. That's not what depression and self-harm is. It's so far from what it is. Like, when people like take their own lives, 9.9 times out of 10, it's not to enact revenge on people who have done them wrong. It's because they literally see no other option for their life, and that just wasn't the vibe that I got here. The vibe that I got with Hannah was that she did this for revenge. She didn't do this because she couldn't see any other aspect of her life. And what also didn't sit well with me was that it seemed to me like Hannah's problems could have been solved had the people in her life given a fuck. Like, the guidance counselor was an absolute piece of shit human being when he was like, just move on. He was like, press charges or just move on. I was like, what the heck? Like, as somebody who wants to become a counselor for at-risk youth and at-risk children, to say to somebody to just move on when they've experienced something that traumatizes them, that does not sit well with me. And I just want to know where he got his degree so I can go there and just be like,
what is your program and why are you teaching people false information?
Because the fact that he felt the need to talk to this teenage girl about why she should move on from all of the different abuses that she was facing and bullying she was facing, or press charges, when we all know that when women press charges against men in court for things that are difficult to prove, nothing's going to happen from it. So I didn't love that, and I thought that's very on brand with the fact that it was a male author who wrote this book. I thought it was it made a lot of sense that it was a man who wrote that. He was like, you press charges or you move on, and that's it. Whereas me thinking about it like as someone who wants to be a counselor, who's taken classes on mental health and stuff like that, it blew my mind that was an option that a counselor, somebody who you're supposed to go to feel better, could even possibly think of. And that bothered me so much. So didn't love that. The only reason I didn't give it a 1 star is because I think the audiobook saved it, and I enjoyed the writing enough to give it a 2, but the concept, the thought process, none of it sits well with me as a reader and as a consumer and as a female. So yeah, didn't love it. Finally, the last book that I ended up reading that I'm not going to go in depth in at all is The Name of the Star by Maureen Johnson. This is a book about a girl who moves to London to go to a boarding school type place, and she ends up coming in contact with ghosts, and she, like, now there's like a Jack the Ripper ghost situation going on. I'm literally not saying anything about this book because the next video you guys will see from me will be Noah and I discussing The Name of the Star and eating our snack crate snacks. So I'm not saying a thing. I'm not saying whether I loved it or whether I hated it. Actually, I'll say if I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. It was easily one of the best books I've read this month. I adored it. Even though, like I said, it doesn't read necessarily like a 5 out of 5 stars, but it was just so entertaining and such an interesting concept that I had to take it and give it a 5 stars. However, I don't necessarily love the way that it ended. Not the way that it ended, but the spin that they took, I didn't love. But that's not a big deal. I will wait to say everything for that in the video that is coming with Noah, because this is the book that we chose to do for our book corner video. So that is super exciting. And that is everything. Thank you so much for tuning into this wrap up. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe. I do post twice a week, and I tried to make it good, but like we've seen me, like it depends on the day, right? And I hope you enjoyed this. If you've read any of these or if you want to read any of these, please comment below and let's talk about them. And until next time, bye readers.